From replacing Daniel Ricciardo at McLaren with a huge legal mess to almost wasting his long-awaited F1 debut, Oscar Piastri is off to a horrible start this season. Here's why the F1 curse could come back to bite him. Honestly, everyone's reevaluating his career move to McLaren right now. Basically, after his F1 debut at the Bahrain Grand Prix lasted only 13 laps, right before his car gave up due to some electrical issue. His teammate Lando Norris made it to the end of the race, but he still finished last, and 2 laps down thanks to an air pressure leak which had him pitting 5 times in the 57-lap Grand Prix. With that, McLaren was off to a horrible start this season, and while everyone had Ricciardo to blame for their horrible performance over the past 2 years, this time they've really gotta figure out what went wrong. I mean, even at the launch of the MCL 60 in February and around the start of preseason testing, CEO Zach Brown confirmed that they still weren't able to hit a few key development targets. Having said that, McLaren hasn't been at its best ever since 2020. The team finished 3rd in the championship and has only moved down the ladder ever since. They finished 4th in 2021 and 5th in 2022, and now in 2023, it seems like even the 5th position seems like a huge achievement, considering how the Bahrain Grand Prix went. Speaking of which, Oscar might be regretting his McLaren transition right now, because Alpine seems to be doing pretty great. In fact, Pierre Gasly recovered from the 20th position on the grid, only to score points all the way in 9th. So maybe switching to McLaren wasn't the best idea after all. But many wouldn't even blame him, because they think he's stuck with some Aussie F1 curse. Basically, the curse of Australians choosing the wrong teams at the wrong time. And Ricciardo's a perfect example of that. Ever since he left Red Bull, things have only gone downhill. And think about it. He left the team because his former teammate Max Verstappen was getting the spotlight thanks to his talent and young age. And now he's back on the team, but he's a reserve driver, and Verstappen's a 2-time world champion. The dynamics definitely aren't the same anymore. And Karun Chendo said he's concerned that Piastri is also following the trend of Australian drivers making terrible career choices, the ones that could come back to bite them. And I've got a bunch of other examples for you. Take Alan Jones' transition to Beatrice Haas, or Mark Webber choosing Williams over Renault. Jones was pretty much persuaded to come out of his second retirement to race for the team, right before he quit F1 for good. And that wasn't the end of it. It turns out Ferrari reached out to him in 1982, right after the death of Gilles Villeneuve. But he didn't accept the offer, and the team went on to win the 1982 and 1983 constructor titles. On the other hand, Webber was lined up by Renault team boss Flavio Briatore to switch to the French team back in 2005, but he gave up the opportunity to stick to the Williams team instead. And guess what happened? Alonso and Renault went on to win double championships in 2005 and 2006. Meanwhile, Webber's Williams tenure was a mess. He even said it was the lowest time in his entire F1 career. And Ricciardo's switch from Renault to McLaren killed a career that could have won world titles. And now, it's time to see how it turns out for Oscar, who's off to a terrible start anyway. Let's not forget, he's known for his talent. In fact, some engineers at Prema said he might even be better than Charles Leclerc. Yep, he's that good. On top of that, they said he was the best young talent they'd come across through junior formulas ever since Verstappen. But it's not only up to Piastri to figure out how to save McLaren in the 2023 season. I mean, he can only do so much if the machinery isn't gonna let him create a name for himself, and every driver's F1 debut is a pretty crucial time. Chento even went down memory lane, back to Lewis Hamilton's F1 debut. Sure, it was already already with the top team, but it was still one of the best rookie seasons in Formula One. And he was right at the front in every race, and that's super important because throughout your first season, you need to make sure you're not buried at the back of the grid because you're not making an impact then. And that's what it looks like for Oscar right now. But it seems like the team's still pretty hyped despite the terrible weekend in Bahrain. McLaren team boss Andrea Stella says there are a bunch of positive things to focus on too. For starters, he thinks that both drivers had the potential to score points. On the one hand, we saw Oscar overtaking cars in the first stint. Meanwhile, Lando could have easily made it to the top spots if it weren't for technical issues. All in all, it was a pretty tight race that could have been a game changer. Sure, the car struggles are still concerning, but he was pretty positive about his drivers who seemed to do a remarkable job with whatever they had on the grid. And with a few improvements, Stella hopes to see the team in the midfield, or even close to other top teams like Red Bull, Mercedes, and even Ferrari. And it's not just the team boss who's looking at the bright side. Even Piastri is reflecting on his bittersweet F1 debut. Even though he retired just 14 laps into the first race, he thinks it was going pretty well right until the gearbox issues came into play, and he trusts the team to figure that one out before the next race. Meanwhile, on social media, he was pretty hyped for his F1 debut and called it a childhood dream turned reality. Sure, it wasn't the end they expected, but he still thinks he's gonna be able to make up for it in other races throughout the season, because he's ready to bounce back stronger with McLaren. At the same time, his teammate made a pretty wild claim. Lando Norris claims the Bahrain Grand Prix wasn't as bad as expected. Okay, just one question. How bad were they expecting it to be then? Because frankly, this seemed pretty unexpected. It turns out that since they missed their targets over the winter, they weren't keeping sky-high expectations from the car anyway. The good thing, though, is that they know what went wrong, so they're gonna be able to fix it before these issues take over the entire season. And according to Norris, even if both cars had the same issue, it was something they hadn't seen before. It didn't come up in testing or anything, so they weren't really prepared for it. Despite all that, and the fact that the team registered a second 0 score from the opening race in Bahrain, Norris and the team are pretty confident that they're gonna recover from this sooner than you think, because as long as the cars aren't acting up with some gearbox or electrical issue, the teammates are gonna be remarkable on the grid. Or at least, that's what we're expecting. If not, it seems like McLaren is going to the back of the grid, and this time they can't pin it on Ricciardo either. Sure, he wasn't performing at his best, but he insisted on car struggles throughout his seasons at McLaren. It's only a matter of time before we see how the team recovers from this. Until then, this was everything you needed to know about the F1 curse and Oscar's horrible McLaren start.